Well, that was a little creepier than I expected. Hello again, I'm Matthew Gore from lightandmatter.org, and if you're looking for an incredibly sharp portrait lens, you're in luck. This time, we're looking at the Sigma 135mm f1.8 Art Series lens for Sony E-mount, which when it was released back in 2017 was heralded as one of the sharpest portrait lenses on the market, and the Sony 135mm f1.8 G Master lens, which was announced last winter, and tests at Lens Rentals almost immediately showed it was the highest resolution lens of its type on the market. So they're both super sharp lenses, but there are some obvious differences. The Sigma lens is about a ½ inch longer and about a ½ pound heavier than the Sony, though they do both still have 82mm filter threads. And while they're both weather sealed to some degree, the Sony lens also has the typical focus lock button and a manual aperture ring, which can be declicked for use while shooting video. And as usual, there's another big difference between the two lenses. About $500 in price. Now these are portrait lenses, so it makes sense to look at how they perform for photographing people, and we will. But a lot of people will also want to use them for shooting events like weddings or even concerts and other low-light work. So we're going to take a look at some event coverage first. But before that, I'm going to just very quickly take a moment to see if there's any sort of visible difference in resolution between the two lenses, because, well, I'm curious, and that's what I do. So I took these shots of the Seattle skyline with Mount Rainier just edging into the frame. Let's look at the center resolution to begin with, shot with the Sony a7R III. Here, zoomed in to 100% on these buildings, we immediately see that both lenses are producing really sharp images. And I'm not sure I can see any practical difference in sharpness here in the rendered video, but in Photoshop, these antennas up on the roof are maybe a little bit sharper on the Sony side, but it's close. Stopping down to f2, there's not a whole lot of difference. Certainly neither one pulls out in front. And stop down to f2.8, they are both exquisitely sharp, but again, neither one is really better than the other here. At f4, the Sony is sharper, and the Sigma gets worse than it was at f2.8. And as much as I'd rather just ignore this, I'm going to have to take a slight detour into the Sigma f4 problem. Those of you who have seen my comparison of the Sony and Sigma 24mm f1.4 lenses will already be familiar with this. In that video, for no reason that I could explain, the Sigma lens produced slightly blurry images at f4. I compared 4 or 5 different shots at 2.8 and 4, and each time the f4 image was worse. And then the images reverted back to normal behavior at f5.6 and got nice and sharp. But this only happened with the Sigma lens, not the Sony. And now we see it again with the Sigma 135mm f1.8. Check it out. Here's the Sigma shot at f2.8, and here's the one at f4, clearly not as sharp. This one is a little better than the previous one at f4, but still not better than f2.8, like it should be. So here's another pair of shots from a few hours earlier in the day. Same thing, the f2.8 side looks great, the f4 side is blurry. And another frame at f4 is still blurry. Here's a set with a slightly different composition, no Mount Rainier here, but if you look at the ladder on the f2.8 side, it's perfectly sharp, but not at f4. And I have several more examples, but you get the idea. After discovering this phenomenon in the 24mm art lens, I emailed my contacts at Sigma and ended up sending them about 25 raw files so that they could investigate the issue too. Before I get into their response, what they didn't say was, "We couldn't replicate the problem, it must be a problem with your camera." Instead, after some initial comments suggesting that the problem was probably limited to just the lens I was testing, I got an email that said, "I just wanted to let you know we have escalated this scenario to Sigma Japan for investigation and next steps." Then they suggested that maybe the problem could be fixed with the USB dock if it really is a problem, but then I never heard back from them. And now we find it again in the Sigma 135mm lens, a lens that is completely unrelated to the 24mm, except that it shares a native E-mount, which means that there is either a problem with my camera, which seems unlikely at this point, or there may be a widespread issue with Sigma art lenses for Sony E-mount. Unless you're specifically looking for it, this problem is really difficult to notice. So if you own a Sony A7 series camera and an art lens in E-mount, please help us all out and shoot a test shot and let me know what you find. Anyway, back to the comparison. If we move away from the center of the image, at f1.8, the details on the Sony side are just a little more contrasty, but it's a tiny difference. Stopping down to f2, I think that the Sony gains a noticeable edge in sharpness, and even at 2.8, the Sony is a hair sharper, but the gap is smaller. At f4, of course, the Sigma is a little blurry, and the Sony looks about the same as f2.8. But at f5.6, they are both back to being beautifully sharp, and at f8, I don't think anything really changes. And finally, we see that even up in the corner, both images are amazingly sharp with the lenses wide open, although the vignetting leaves them both underexposed here. Which is sharper? Maybe the Sony, but I don't think it's obvious if it is. But I think that the Sony does get significantly sharper at f2, and it's a little easier to say that it's better than the Sigma here, though it's still a pretty subtle difference. At f2.8, the vignetting is almost gone, so it's easier to see what's going on here, and I think it's clear that the Sony is quite a bit sharper than the Sigma, which is also still very sharp. Of course, the Sigma gets a little blurry at f4, and the Sony still looks great, but about the same as before. And I'll just say that at f5.6 and f8, both lenses look exquisitely sharp. The Sony may have a little better edge contrast, if anything, but they're extremely close. So, to sum up, I'll say that both lenses are wonderfully sharp. The Sony is slightly sharper away from the center of the image between f2 and f4, but the difference is very subtle. And in all honesty, if you're using either of these lenses and having trouble getting sharp images, the problem probably isn't with the lens. The exception, of course, is with the Sigma at f4, which is still just fine unless you're pixel peeping, but it's not as sharp as it should be. With that out of the way, let's take a look at how these lenses perform when shooting events and action. I decided to start by shooting at the annual May 1st Labor Rally in Seattle, which is usually led by a group of Native Americans. Unfortunately, the Sony hadn't arrived in the mail yet, so I shot all of these with the Sigma. As you can see, the images are all wonderfully sharp, which is great for those times when your composition is a little messy and you have to crop a bit. The Sigma allowed me to capture the detail that I needed, and focus was usually pretty reliable, even in a very chaotic environment. It didn't feel blazingly fast, but it seemed to get the job done anyway. Every now and then, though, I'd attempt to focus on the subject, and the lens would just sit there and do nothing for a second or two, like here. Although focus might have been locked on something in the frame that I wasn't seeing, like these feathers here. When the Sony lens arrived, and I felt how fast the autofocus was with its linear motors, I decided to try shooting some basketball with it, to see how it would keep up. And it was great. I mean, 135mm is not an ideal focal length for basketball. I'm not going to start shooting with one, but the focus was always right on, even when the players were just a few steps away from me. And then I decided to give it a shot with this Sigma lens, and I was pleasantly surprised. I had a few more shots with missed focus maybe, but in general, the Sigma tracked focus remarkably well, again, even when the players were running straight at me. Of course, I don't expect any of you to use either of these lenses to shoot sports, but if you need to track a bride and groom as they're walking down the aisle, for example, Either lens should have no trouble keeping up. Ultimately, the Sony lens focuses faster and is more responsive, but the Sigma is still fast enough for anything short of sports. And really, maybe even some sports. But most people will be buying these lenses for shooting portraits. So I've chosen a few sets of images shot with both lenses that might not be the best portraits, but they should show the differences between how the two lenses render the same scene. So let's start with these two. First of all, the color balance is set exactly the same for these two shots. So you may be able to see that the Sigma produces warmer tones, and the Sony is a little cooler. Obviously, I shot in this location just to have some lights in the background, so we'll take a look at those in a moment. But first, here's how sharp our subject is. I'd be happy with this kind of detail in any of my portraits, I think. Now, looking at the highlights in the background, these bokeh balls are nice and smooth, with none of the concentric circles people sometimes call onion rings that can show up in some lenses, and the borders are about equally contrasty. Now, in this set, I balanced the color of the two shots individually, based on the white Sega logo in the shirt. Zooming in a bit, the Sony image has a little more general contrast, but I don't see any major difference in how the depth and shape of the subject are rendered beyond that. And zooming in to 100%, I see that I focused on the eye more accurately with the Sony lens, but there's still plenty of detail on both sides. So let's look at a full-length shot at f1.8 and see how the background renders. With the Sigma here, we can see that the background is nice and smooth, with a pretty nice transition between the foreground and the background. Looking at the same areas on the Sony shot, the background seems a little bit more patchy to me, not quite as smooth, but it's a minor difference, and the extra contrast makes the subject look a little sharper. Now in these two shots, the color temperature was set to 6,000 degrees Kelvin, so again, you can see that the Sigma produces a warmer image. More importantly, both of these images were shot at f4 instead of 1.8. And if we zoom in to look at the fine detail, everything looks pretty good. I was shooting handheld here, so the effects of the f4 problem with this lens are not really apparent. So this should give you an idea of how minor the f4 problem is for practical purposes. Comparing all of that to the image taken with the Sony lens, here I prefer the cooler colors, although I could just as easily have warmed them up. Maybe removed a little magenta now that I look at it again, but anyway, that's all a matter of taste. Again, there's a little more contrast overall, and when we zoom in on the details, her eyes are nice and sharp, and they'd be even sharper if I'd shot from a tripod. Okay, let's look at one final set of images here, shot wide open, which might have some useful bits in them. First of all, zooming in on the subject, the lenses are sharp enough to show that I missed focus on the eyes. They're back focused on the Sony and front focused on the Sigma. Anyway, what we're looking at in this shot is the background. The sun that's filtering through the trees here gives us some nice highlights to check out, but let's start by looking at some of the closer branches. Up here, the bokeh in this lower branch looks pretty nervous to me on both sides, but I think the doubling is more evident on the Sigma here. In general, we see the same thing as before. The Sigma might look a little smoother, and the Sony maybe a little more contrasty. And if we look down in the bottom at the transition between the focal plane and the background, we can also get a better idea of how smoothly they render that. Okay, so having seen a few of these images now, which lens do you think was used to shoot this? Maybe it'll help if I zoom in a bit. So what lens was it? I'm actually not going to tell you just yet. I thought it might be interesting to see how well you guys can tell the difference between images shot with these lenses. So I made a quiz on my website, including this image. So rather than just showing you a bunch more portrait-y shots, follow the link in the description below to the quiz. I think you'll get a better idea of the differences or lack of differences when you need to take a look and decide for yourself. So give it a shot and let me know in the comments how you do. And now, before I wrap this up, let's just take a quick look at the vignetting of these lenses. Starting with the Sigma, there's no vignetting at 5.6, and as we stop down by thirds of a stop, by f2.8, we start seeing it creep in around the edges, and the light continues to fall off until 1.8, where it nearly reaches the center of the frame, and the corners are darkened pretty significantly. On the Sony lens, we see just about the same thing, with a little visible vignetting at f2.8, and by 1.8, it's just a little bit darker than the Sigma in the corners, maybe a third of a stop. I'd consider them to be pretty equivalent here though. So to wrap this up, when it comes to the build quality, they're both really nicely made and weather sealed, so I'd give them a tie, but maybe give the edge to the Sony since it has the aperture ring and focus lock button. The Sony is definitely quite a bit lighter and a bit shorter, which is usually an advantage. The Sony is also a sharper lens, though the difference is minimal, and they're both super sharp. Again, the autofocus is faster on the Sony, but it's still pretty respectable on the Sigma. Bokeh is really a matter of personal taste, and they're both pretty similar, but my taste leans towards the Sigma. The Sony renders colors a little cooler and the Sigma a bit warmer when shot at the same color settings, and they both have equally bad vignetting. And as we know, the Sony lens costs about $1,900 compared to the Sigma's $1,400, a difference of about $500, which is a significant chunk of money, even for a photographer. In the end, it's worth recognizing that both lenses are wonderfully sharp, with excellent build quality, contrast, color, and rendering. Where the Sony is sharper, it's not much sharper, the f4 problem notwithstanding. Portrait photographers can choose according to their preferences and not worry about the technical differences. However, the Sony lens does have an advantage in autofocus speed for event shooters, as well as a manual aperture ring for filmmakers, and it weighs less. Whether those things are worth $500 to you will depend on the type of work you do. If I were just shooting portraits, I might opt for the Sigma, but as a photojournalist, I'd go with the Sony. And that's it. Don't forget to check out the lens quiz if you haven't already, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please like the video and follow my channel. See you next time.